Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're joining us, whether that's live or on demand. My name is Ali Hirji, and I lead the Center for Cybersecurity and the AI Hub at Durham College. Welcome to episode 1 of the Cyber Resilience Hour. Resilience. A dictionary definition, or I should be true to myself, a Google definition will tell you that the word resilience simply means the ability to come back after a moment of distress or trial. A second definition will read, the ability for an object or a person to come back to their original state after being in a spot of extreme pressure. Scalability, elasticity, if you will. I think nobody would argue with me that over the last 18 months, our system here in Ontario, public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, for-profit, large organizations, small organizations, have all been under some form of systemic stress, whether that comes from financial challenges, operational challenges, and cybersecurity challenges as well. And my guests today are individuals who have displayed a great deal of resilience, helping not only their organizations, their own individual selves, but this province remain resilient as we face a new era of work, a quote-unquote new normal, helping us address some of the challenges and come back to as close to a normal functional state as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to jump deep into episode number 1. I've said this before, cybersecurity is a process, not a product, and we'll learn a lot about the resilient processes set in place by these leaders here in Ontario. I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about what they do, and tell us about the special subcommittees that they're a part of with the province. We'll start off first with Scott. Welcome to the Cyber Resilience Hour. Scott, tell us a little bit about your work and your involvement with the province.
Hey, Ali, thanks very much. So my name is Scott Currie. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. It's been my honor to serve in that position now for the last 5 years. And through that process, I've learned an awful lot about cybersecurity in healthcare and some of the challenges that it faces. I became involved with the expert panel that we all sit on back in October, and recently I'm serving as the chair of the Communication and Stakeholder Relations Subcommittee.
Fantastic. And I've been on sessions with Scott before, and one of the things that I can tell you is that he always reminds me to focus on knowing what you do not know, constantly learning, constantly looking at opportunities to engage. And I appreciate you, Scott, for not only the work that you do at Sick Kids, but more importantly, the efforts that you're putting in to engage at a provincial level. Scott, thank you for taking the time. I understand how busy you are. Truly well appreciated. Second, we'll go over to Helen. Just got to meet her over the last 24 hours. Seems like a very exciting individual. Helen, I'll turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about what it is that you do. And like Scott, what is your involvement at the provincial level?
Thank you, Ali. Yes, my name is Hélene Fournier. I'm an executive director with the Valoris for children and adults in Prescott-Russell. We're a multi-service organization, and I've joined the panel in October like everybody else, and part of the group with Scott and Andrew about the communication and stakeholder. And really, I'm representing the child welfare sector, so all the Children's Aid Society. That's my role at this with the panel.
Fantastic. And I think it's extremely important that our audience also realizes that cybersecurity doesn't operate in silos. It's not just an executive issue or a technical issue. It's not just something that's reserved for people of a certain age bracket. It's impacting all of us as we engage in this new reality and the new digital revolutions that we face ourselves in. And I'm looking forward to learning more from you, Helen, on the education and training pieces of work and the outreach pieces of work that you're involved in. Thank you as well for taking the time. I do understand how busy you are, and I appreciate every moment that we're spending with you. Last but not the least, another individual that I've got to meet for the first time today, someone who definitely has been around the block when it comes to cybersecurity and has a lot to share. Andrew, my friend, over to you to tell us a little bit about what you do and what is your involvement at the provincial level.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being invited to join this talk. My background is with CSIS. I was intelligence officer, and I actually spent some time with the province in the Office of Provincial Security Advisor. I'm now an independent security consultant, helping organizations with cybersecurity and information security. And as Scott mentioned, I serve on the subcommittee, the communications and stakeholder subcommittee. So very happy to be here and meet you and join this panel discussion.
Fantastic. The pleasure is all mine. And I truly appreciate the diverse and eclectic perspectives that we have at the table today. So for the next, dare I say, 35 to 40 minutes, we're going to go into a bit of a discussion around education and training and engagement. And I'm going to start a little bit first. I'm going to start with Alan, then we'll go to Scott, and then we'll go forward from there. And I want to ask you a question in terms of education and training. Times have changed. The way people are absorbing information has changed. No two learners or no one size fits all when it comes to cybersecurity learning. There are different age groups that we need to train, different age brackets, different learning abilities that we have to take into account when providing cybersecurity education and training. Helen, can you give us some perspective on what new items or innovations are you seeing when it comes to education and training in cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a good question for me because my expertise is not at all in the information technology piece. I'm in a social worker field. So I think what it's really important is to understand what the user needs to be mindful of their responsibility and their role in cybersecurity and cyber resiliency. So I think what will be the future is to find different ways to bring user to get the information they need to know what they don't know, actually, like Scott said, because I think that's where the future holds. And once you're mindful of your responsibility in your role, you're a little bit more aware and you make very different decisions. So I'm thinking training at different level, but adapted to the knowledge of the user so they fully understand and they feel that they can make a difference in their gesture every day.
Absolutely. And I think that key element of communication and knowledge translation, the ability to translate intense technical concepts into ways that are digestible for different learners. I always make mention of this is that when I teach, for example, in cybersecurity, or when I've been at a variety of hackathons, even here in Ontario, we've noticed that teams are not just made up of highly technical folks. You have philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, etc. Cybersecurity is truly an interdisciplinary platform and discipline. So thank you, Ellen, for that perspective. Scott, I want to come to you a little bit and talk about these levels of training. With your work in the medical sector and with healthcare workers, are you seeing a renewed need to provide more cybersecurity training and education? And if things changed in the recent past, given the kind of swings we've had with the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think training is a fundamental core component of any cybersecurity strategy for any organization of any size. And I think training really has evolved over the years. If you think back, even just the 5 years that I've been with Sick Kids, we've seen a massive shift in the way cybersecurity threats are being perpetrated against institutions. And it's moving from being something that used to be very technical and in the realm of the technical security professional to something that is very much tailored and personally delivered to individuals within the organization. And so more so now than ever, people don't need to hear about, antivirus software and those types of things, but they need to understand the nature of the actor that's attempting to get them to hand over information. And what they're doing is really trying to target people in different ways than they ever have before. So we're seeing training now shift from being something that's focusing on what the organization is doing to really focusing on how you as an individual working for an organization can begin to identify the new nature of threats that are coming in. And beyond that, also beginning to frame the training in a slightly different way, which is, we're not training individuals necessarily to protect the organization. We're trying to build a set of skills in the individual so that they can protect the organization, but also recognize that these same attacks are being delivered to them personally. And so the type of training now is about a skills development, a recognition and understanding of the different ways that the actors are trying to get into your own personal life or the institution, so people can begin to recognize, flag, and escalate those things so that we can take actions to block them or otherwise protect the organization. But I think framing things, in a different way, recognizing that, people's personal lives and their families have these same threats, it really creates a new paradigm in the way we need to begin the conversation about what cybersecurity actually means for all of us as individuals.
Absolutely. And I think these are important points that have been raised. I'm sure that from a provincial perspective as well, there's a lot of emphasis on why these attacks also hit healthcare institutions, and they have grown tremendously, especially as a result of the pandemic. I'm sure our audience may have heard in the early days of the pandemic, which doesn't seem too long ago, actually, we had stories coming out of the European Union where certain hospitals were attacked. and it actually had a life and death consequence in a couple of cases. So there's quite a lot that we will unpack as we continue the conversation there. Scott, thank you very much for that perspective. Andrew, I want to loop you into this conversation in a bit of an interesting way. You've had a very fruitful career with the province. You've had very frontline cybersecurity roles, senior roles as well, and you're an independent consultant. Do you find yourself also providing some training? Do you do stuff like tabletop exercises? How are you seeing the education and training demands impacting your consulting practices?
Well, yes, and I think it goes back to something that Scott said, where we need people to understand that they're part of the solution, that organizations are really only as strong as their weakest link. So to making sure that everybody is independently, we talk about resilient, but has the tools that understands how their security awareness impacts the organization as a whole is very, very important. So part of that is that individualized, personalized training to the individuals in the role to explain, the importance that they have in securing the organization, and we're seeing that, to build up on Scott's point, and to your point, as far as the issues that are out there are very public, and I think that helps with awareness training as well. Is that we have these examples that we can draw on that are very public examples where there are life and death situations or organizations have been severely impacted by, sometimes very minor roundabout cybersecurity issues that, hopefully with some training can be addressed and make the organization more resilient. So, having these examples public, being able to deal with all individuals, I think only helps and is very, very important.
Absolutely. And I think the key here is for folks to understand that everybody plays a role in the response to a cybersecurity incident. You've heard this said many times, that it's not about if it happens, but when it happens, sure. But it really comes down to the quality of the response. Some time ago, I heard about this very famous, not a famous, I would say, but an interesting saying where, a city or a particular town that is hurricane prone is not going to be measured by the fact that they have measures in place to protect against a hurricane. Is going to happen. How they respond and how they come back from it is really the true test and measure of their grit. And I think later on, as we go through the conversation, we'll go a little bit into education and training and incident response as well. What do you do when something happens? So thank you for setting the context for this conversation. If it's okay with you, I'll keep the same trend of conversation going and the same features. And we'll start off with Helen first. Helen, in your work, not necessarily directly involved in InfoSec, but playing a major role in mobilizing the community, etc. Things have been extremely busy. People are moving in multiple directions at the same time. A lot of anxiety right now with where things are headed. Cybersecurity is an important priority. How have you tried to at least start the conversation? Are you seeing people are now more receptive to it? Are you seeing that there's more interest in learning? Or is there more hesitancy and nervousness around people and their roles in creating a more cyber secure environment? Helen, your perspective.
That's a good question, and I would say there's a little bit of both. So I think what I'm seeing in my role and in the sector, the child welfare sector, is that the discussion is starting to happen. We were fortunate enough that we had a training not long ago on cybersecurity, and I think it brought awareness and a little bit more of, I would say, a toolkit to my colleagues and myself in terms of what should we be mindful of, how should we be prepared in the eventuality that we get a situation that we need to deal with it. So the training gave us a lot of tools, and I think it was timely for the sector because there's been a few situations that affected our sector. And I think it gave us the permission to talk about it. I always say that cybersecurity is a taboo subject. People don't want to talk about it because they're afraid that if you do talk about it, it's going to happen to you. And I'm on the opposite side. I think we need to talk about it more. And the child welfare sector, as you mentioned, Ali, has a lot of issues which are related to dealing with person directly. But I think cybersecurity, cyber resiliency is not talked enough in this sector, and that's the role that I'm trying to play to make sure that I bring it up and I make it okay to talk about it. Because as soon as you start the conversation, you'll learn a lot about the experience of others. And I think the key to when it does happen to you, it's to be aware of how you should prepare. So it limits the, I would say, the madness when a crisis happens. At least you have an expectation. You're clearer in terms of what the process should be like. So I think talking about it helps you to be better prepared. Nobody wants to go through it. But as you said, it's like an hurricane or like a tornado. It's going to happen to you. So how are you going to react to it? And it's important to be ready.
Absolutely, and proactive reaction to those kind of scenarios. I think, Alan, what you're also emphasizing is the crucial role that individuals like yourself play. Like I said earlier on knowledge translation, I say this a lot of time in my classes where communication is fundamental in the cybersecurity practice, and we need to be listening to understand, not to reply. Working with the same framework of people, process, and technology, Scott, I want to come to you because cybersecurity is not just about the technology; it's about the people as well. And leading such an important organization, are you also doing any activities or any work to inform patients about some cybersecurity practices, to inform parents about some cybersecurity practices? What's your public engagement phase looking like right now?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think it's an area that doesn't get nearly enough focus. And I would say, even within our institution, it's not something that's been a key topic of conversation, but it certainly has begun to make its way into a number of different ways that we communicate. We've gone through some efforts around modernizing our guest wireless infrastructure, and as part of that, have deployed new security tools and capabilities to help our patients and families be safe within the organization. But I think also just healthcare in general, the number of public events that have happened in healthcare have inherently in and of themselves raised the overall tenor around what healthcare institutions are doing to protect patient data. As you mentioned, in Europe, we've had some incidents that have resulted in some fairly tragic events, but within North America and in Ontario itself, there's been quite a number of very large, very public, and very significant outages directly resulting from cybersecurity that have had major impact. And as these things begin to make their way into the news and they begin to make their way into the public consciousness, it becomes incumbent upon us as leaders within our respective institutions to start having conversations about how we, as an organization, can do better. We definitely are trying to make ourselves, as much of a leader within healthcare as possible in terms of being able to deliver, top-tier cybersecurity capabilities to protect our patients' information. And we do always make sure it's a priority as we talk to all of our patients and families that, in addition to providing obviously great care for them and our clinical and research capabilities that are top notch, we really want to ensure that they have a fundamental trust in the fact that we as an institution are doing everything we can to make sure that their data stays private, that the systems that they rely upon and the capabilities that are necessary to provide those clinical care, that all of that is going to be available when it's necessary, because the reality of not having these critical life-saving systems available is it can and likely will have a significant impact on both our patients and more broadly in the healthcare community. It's not a matter of we stand alone. It's really a matter of we have to stand together, because the reality of a major cybersecurity incident to any one of the major hospitals in the Toronto area would result in a significant impact on every other hospital. And so we really need to recognize that as much as possible, we need to be sharing knowledge, not only with our patients, not only with our staff, but with our peers in other institutions, so that we can create a system that allows us to build resilient cybersecurity frameworks that don't just focus on an institution, but begin to look at the sector as a whole. And again, the work that we do on this panel is beginning to take that beyond just the sector view and looking at how do we support the provincial view as well. How do we start to bring these cybersecurity frameworks to the level that we can help shape a system across all of the different public sector and public sector adjacent organizations, such that we can all be resilient in our own ways, but also have us prop up the system respectively so that we can support both ourselves as well as all of our colleagues across the province.
I couldn't have said that better. And I think that element of resiliency comes a great deal with our teamwork and ability to work together. As they say, right? If you want to go fast, you go alone. You want to go far, you go together. And I think that you've been an emblem and a huge proponent of that, not just at your workplace, but across Ontario. So once again, thank you, both of you, for your very, very interesting perspective. I think what's even interesting is now that we've seen a lot of kids going back to school, and over the last 12 months or so, a lot of cybersecurity awareness training, people have become aware of concepts like social engineering. I looked at my feed today and I saw a lot of comments about people saying, hey, you want to be careful about sharing that picture which has data about, what they want to become when they grow up, etc. Data indeed is the new oil. And hopefully one day we can do a session on mining that data and why bad actors are interested in that. Scott, Hélène, thank you so much for that. Andrew, I'm going to take a flight and come over to you now because I want to twist a little bit of my question. And given your work and what you've seen and the engagements that you have at a variety of levels, let's stay to the topic of communication. I mentioned earlier on that cybersecurity is not just about the Scotts of the world and the Helenes and myself and other individuals involved in the practical day-to-day things. It also involves boards. It involves executive leaders who they can spell cybersecurity, but don't know anything else beyond that. What are some techniques or strategies to start getting boards, executive individuals engaged in the cybersecurity communication practice, but not just engaged meaningfully?
Well, it's a great question. And I think, it really does start at the top for most organizations to have that time of leadership, to model good behavior, to make that a part of the structure, the corporate culture, be it a company or the province or what have you. It is so important to engage leadership in cybersecurity, those conversations. One, so that the professionals have the tools and are well supported for what they need to keep the organization safe, but also so that all the individuals in the organization realize they have a role to play, as we've talked about before. And I think there is an awareness. I think from the communications perspective, and getting back to our subcommittee, which is communications and stakeholder engagement, that is something that we want to emphasize, which is making sure that we are able to articulate make situational awareness, that people need to hear it, so that they can then pass along that knowledge down throughout the organizations, because it is really critical that that leadership understands the challenges they face and have the support to deal with it, both the information from the professionals and also from the people that feel comfortable to go to them and say, I need a little more support, to deal with this growing challenge for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think I would add to that to say is that when you start thinking about cyber practices in an organization, yes, there's the actual deployment of technical tools and knowing how to use them, but there are budgetary consideration, legal considerations now around privacy, so on and so forth. Without sort of diving deep into the subject, when you've seen discussions happening on vaccination passports, at one side you see the IT discussion, but now you're starting to see HR is suddenly involved and legal is involved, etc. And I think the times are pushing us towards those paths where you're having more inclusive discussions around security, but really a lot of pressure falls on cybersecurity professionals to be very, very strong communicators. Hélène, I want to come to you because in the little bit that I've got to know you and looking at the responsibilities that you have on your shoulders, and by your own admission, not being academically trained necessarily in InfoSec or cybersecurity, you've taken it on yourself to train yourself. You've taken it on yourself to gather some resources to make yourself more aware. Can you tell us a little bit about how you keep up to date with what's happening in the world of cybersecurity? And what are some of the resources that you rely on, besides, of course, geniuses like Scott and Andrew, of course?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I've learned a lot through the expert panel, I have to be quite honest, because we represent a very wide variety of sectors. So the discussion that we're having at the panel are really, really a good source of information and knowledge. But I also started being more mindful of what's going on somewhere else. So I'm reading about the situation. I'm reading about all the warning we get from the community of practice and the Ministry of the Government and the Consumer. So I've been more, I would say, attracted to what's touching cybersecurity, cyber resiliency, and I'm really digging deeper to further my understanding, and I have discussion with my team within my organization, and just to make sure that we are at the level of resiliency that we should be, and having very, very open discussion about knowledge, capacity, funding, having a limited funding to improve our system. So having a knowledge of what we have and where we should be. So I would say that in the last year and a half, my learning curve have been exponential. I still have a lot to learn, but I think that it's my responsibility as a executive director and part of the panel to keep on being aware, so I can contribute and make the difference in my sector, bring forward some discussion with the association that we're part of, because the Children's Aid Society are part of an association, but also within my organization, and like you mentioned before, with the board of administration, because they need to be aware and mindful. And often enough, there are people from the community who are not expert in cybersecurity, so they need someone to start the discussion with them and bring forward the elements that they should be mindful of to do their due diligence.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better. Learning is indeed a journey, not a destination. You've got to put that effort in there, right? And it's not about the formal academic credentials. It really is about showing up to these different conferences. The power of showing up should never be underestimated. And thank you so much for that very eloquent response and very useful for our listeners. Scott, I'll come back to you. And on the flip side of it, Scott, you've been in this space for a very, very long time. You've engaged in multiple technical accreditations. You've engaged in multiple different types of trainings and workshops. Given the pressures that you're under, given some of the expectations, the new trends and threats and vulnerabilities that are emerging, how do you, as a seasoned professional specialist in cybersecurity, how do you think about your own education and training portfolio? What do you do to sort of stay ahead of, quote unquote, the bad actors?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting challenge because it is moving so very rapidly. But fundamentally, the core concepts of cybersecurity largely remain the same, which is really that all of this needs to be looked at in a risk lens. Understanding the nature of the risks and the nature of the threats allows you to build an understanding of what the response capabilities need to be in order to meet those requirements. And so, the response capabilities are the things really as much as anything that are evolving over time and creating, new and more intelligent platforms that can be used to deliver cybersecurity monitoring or response capabilities within an organization. So it's really important to kind of frame things around really keeping abreast of what the true risks are within an organization, within a sector, within a province, as we do, and working very closely with technology partners to understand their approach to addressing those risks. Obviously attending different conferences, participating on panels like this, where I get to learn from the other folks that I'm chatting with. There's a variety of different methods that you need to ensure that you're doing to make sure that you stay up to date. But really, a lot of the concepts have not changed over time. It really just sort of looking at different ways of filling in those gaps and different ways of moving towards addressing those risks. And I think if you ensure that your organizations are looking at things through a risk lens as opposed to through a technology lens, it sets you up significantly better to be able to build out a response framework, a set of capabilities, a set of processes and technologies to support all of that, that lets you ensure that you're mitigating those risks in the most appropriate way. And so that's the approach that I take, is obviously keep as knowledgeable as I can about technology, but also really keeping a sharp focus on the risk.
Absolutely. Vote Scott for Cybersecurity Learner of the Year. A very comprehensive plan that you've put together. And I think everyone has to design their own learning approach. Your learning styles. Some folks enjoy using platforms. For example, quite recently, I started using certain platforms like Minute School out of Waterloo. Very quick, digestible bits of information. Some folks enjoy reading the more intense, data-driven, lots of dive in depth into something. So I think learners have to appreciate their learning styles and work within that. I also really like the fact, Scott, that you emphasized on the element of risk. You're never eliminating risk, you're constantly lowering it, or at least addressing it in some shape or fashion. Yep. Scott, as always, thank you for a very clear and well-framed response. I want to take this conversation a little bit further, Andrew, and it wouldn't be a session with me if I didn't go slightly off script. And, when you think about education and training, we also have to think about the testing component. Often, and if you just think about the general public trying to build their own cyber resiliency, there are different organizations trying to be more resilient from a cyber perspective, you often find that some folks get hesitant about doing some training or education programming because there's some testing at the end, and that comes with a grade. I don't necessarily want to go into the pedagogy of testing and grading, but can you tell me a little bit about how do you manage that? How do you get people to feel a little bit more comfortable with going through a very formal education and training process in cybersecurity?
Well, I think it probably goes back a little bit to something that Scott said earlier, which is really that we're not just teaching people to protect the organization, but really themselves. And when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're so interconnected, our world, that to know that when we are being cyber secure, that we are protecting ourselves, protecting those close to us, our networks. Many times, those most vulnerable to us, most vulnerable who are connected to us. From challenges. So I think to try to make sure people understand the importance, which many do because there are many public examples of it, but also what they can do to contribute to make sure that everyone's safe and how that contributes to the wider community. I think that's where we get into people taking a little more personal responsibility for cybersecurity, is when they understand those risks and how it impacts them personally, and then those close to them. So when we go back to kind of that idea of a resilient community, it starts with ourselves and it goes out to those who are closest to us and our work and our companies and the province and national security. I mean, we're really asking people when we say that we're only as strong as our weakest link to participate in cybersecurity for the betterment of everybody. And if that's something that our communications and stakeholder subcommittee can make that point, it's that in this case for the province of Ontario, this many different organizations, people are connected to the systems, networks of the province, that we all have a role to play. And so to get to, it's, sometimes it can be difficult, and we're asking people to go through training at all different levels, appropriate to their levels and expertise, that we do emphasize that it's important, and we want to make sure they've retained the information. And that's where I think that we can hopefully get some penetration as far as people buy in at all levels to what is appropriate to those levels.
Absolutely. And I think it's really about encouraging folks. You fall 7 times, you get up to get up the 8th time, right? I do think that, we do need to think a little bit about our cultures around grades and testings and accolades around that to make such trainings more accessible. But I feel like the conversation is happening, and there are a lot of, and to the audience that's listening, you don't just see learning management systems now, you see learning engagement systems, lots of gamification that's happening as well. So as we go into the last phase of our questions, I'll come back to the subject of gamification. We've got about 5 more minutes left, and I want to have a little bit of a discussion more on the communication side as well. Helen, in keeping with the train of thought that we followed, I'll start with you first. Now, you'll forgive me if I'm making an assumption here, but my understanding is that you are bilingual, you are working in different environments, or at least your organizations are providing services in different languages. Whether it's French, whether it's any other languages, in Ontario, multiple languages are spoken. Do you see any challenges with getting cybersecurity information out there in multiple languages? And are you doing any work to ensure that our French-speaking populace has access to resources? Folks speaking different Indigenous languages, whatever else have you. Are you trying to do some work there as well?
Yes, that's a good question. I would say that it's always a challenge because English is the language of the majority. So often enough, you will have to, there's a lot of information being translated, but the technical terms are usually in English. So we really need to adjust. I don't know about the other language because my organization serves people in French and in English mostly. But in French, I know it's always a challenge. And I've been worked with a group of experts in cybersecurity recently. Everything was done in English, and it posed a challenge for some people in my organization that French is their first language. So it's remained an issue. But technically speaking, my team is really fluent in IT terms. And you get by, but it remains a challenge. And I know that the Center of Excellence has been doing an excellent job to making sure that they provide the material in both official language. I wouldn't know about the others, but I know that there's an effort being made, and it's really appreciated because it brings the attention of the Francophone population to the cybersecurity information that they need to feel comfortable and get accustomed to the language. And I think it's really important to continue and working on this, having more and more information available in at least the both official language. And for the others, I cannot speak about it because I really don't know.
Oh, absolutely. I think brilliant points that you brought up. And I think what you've also referenced is, from an education perspective, the need to provide more programming in different languages. A while ago, I don't remember which organization I was with, we were having some discussions where one of the threat intel leads had mentioned that it's so useful to have folks that speak multiple languages, because when you're analyzing threat intelligence feeds, when you're looking at geopolitical context, you don't just look at data, you look at context. Where is something coming from? What have they been saying? And you're analyzing things for sentiment or semantics. Knowing different languages really creates a very strong cybersecurity workforce as well. So very good points there that you brought up, and thank you so much for that. We'll come to some closing comments very, very shortly. Scott, the last question for you as you're on the hot seat, and I'll work with the same communication angle. Remember earlier on, I talked about gamification and communicating through points and badges and sort of accolades and awards in the digital space. Is that something that, from a perspective of communication and bringing people together on cybersecurity, is gamification something that you're looking at as well?
But I think it has to be, because it really demonstrates, quite sharply that there's different means of communication that need to be used these days versus what may have worked well in the past. I mean, fundamentally, the number of different generations that need to be spoken to when you talk about IT security and IT security issues is really everybody. And recognizing that there are different ways of learning, there are different ways of engaging with material, you naturally have to think about different ways to reach out to those different types of generations. I mean, I'm a relatively old guy, and when I look at my kids have grown up with screens in front of them, the amount of sort of technical capability that they have is substantially more than was available when I was younger. And conversely, the attention spans to some degree get shorter. And so there's different ways that you need to find to be able to talk to different generations. When I talk about security related issues with my kids, it's certainly very different than the way I talk with my parents and grandparents. And so gamification, I think, is really an opportunity for us to create a different context for delivering this important material, so that really we create an opportunity for everybody to be engaged in a conversation about what cybersecurity is, why it's important, and how that cybersecurity can be translated in such a way that it can have an impact on them, their lives, and the organizations that they work for. And I know for us as Thick Kids, it is really part of our conversation about how we build our learning modules. It's no more having 5 slides and you sign an acknowledgement at the end of it, and that's my annual training. It has to go well beyond that. And thinking about different ways of having people engage really helps to ensure that A, they're not tuning out, and that B, hopefully more of that material is being retained because it's being delivered in a more engaging way. So I think it's a natural evolution of training curriculum as a whole, and certainly one of many different ways that we need to ensure that we're engaging in conversations around cybersecurity and what people can do to help make themselves stronger.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. Scott, 21 is not old, so I just wanted to throw that out there. But I agree with you, is that you really have to start to learn how to package information differently. And I find that very often, if I'm speaking to a dean, I talk about security different. I'm speaking to the IT folks, it's a little different. And that's an art and skill in and of itself. So for the last question, working on what both Helen and Scott had mentioned, Andrew, I'll bring you to the table. And when it comes to education resources, training, and keeping content relevant, the cybersecurity space is evolving by the second. How do you make sure that the content that you're providing your staff, the information that you're providing, is timely, is relevant? There are a lot of resources that go into it. What do you suggest as best practices to evaluate the content that you're putting out there to ensure that your staff is being given up-to-date information, keeping them resilient as possible? Andrew?
That's an excellent question. And I think that's one of the great challenges, is making sure that we're all staying on top of the threats we're facing and the evolving nature of those threats. And maybe going back to earlier points about communication and working together, as you said, where you go alone and go together, I think that making sure that we're all on top of the risks, that we all have relevant and accurate material, that we can share and use resources as much as possible will be a huge benefit. And that really gets back to that communication point, to make sure that our material that we are sharing, the learning material, is relevant. To Scott's point, that we are able to target that at all levels to make sure that engagement is effective, because, as I said, the different generations are going to consume material differently. And so if we have people have a new approach, an effective approach, then I'm all ears. I'm happy to take it and try and implement it. So that I think where we get to that communications piece and that sharing piece of working together is so crucial to make sure that we are able to have that material pass along for awareness and training purposes. So that, I wish I don't have an answer. I just say that is the question. And I think we're all trying to figure that out.
I've always said this and maintained this, and I recommend people put it on a shirt. Cybersecurity is not about answers, it's about questions. More exploration, more analysis, looking at where else are our gaps and knowing your blind spots. With that, we have come about 30 seconds close to the end of our time. So Helen, Scott, and Andrew, I'm going to take this moment to firstly thank you for being a part of the first ever Cyber Resilience episode. I also, on behalf of our audience and on the behalf of the organizers of the province, want to thank you as a citizen of Ontario as well for the time that you put into these committees. Being a part of committees myself, I know that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but I thank you for giving back and ensuring that our communities have more cybersecurity support and a backbone in our community as well. If there's one thing that I've learned is during this whole session, I was reminded of a quote where I forget who told me this. And the individual said, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that you don't put it into a fruit salad. Think about that. Where you thought that you didn't see a cybersecurity situation, there is one. What in the world today in our hyper digital environment does not involve some element of cybersecurity? And I couldn't think of more better people to discuss the education, training, and communication around these new realities of cybersecurity. Once again, thank you for joining us from all across Ontario, from this beautiful province, from these Indigenous lands. I thank you for your time. And to our audience, this is Ali Hirji from Durham College's Center for Cybersecurity and AI Hub, signing out, asking you all to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay cyber safe more than anything at all. Take care, be well.